Hey, how you doing? My name is Angela Kerwin, and I'm your professor of the Lab for Anthropology. Let's get started. Again, I apologize for being a little bit late on this recording this lecture, though I did notice that a lot of you, it seems like, I'm just making excuses. My bad. Ideally, I like to have the week's lectures already pre-recorded the week before, but I got really crazy busy with finishing up grading at 3 colleges for spring. And then I had to leave town for 4 days for my mother-in-law's 86-year-old birthday, and all the nieces and nephews would be there. So it was like a reunion. It's up in the mountains. It's like, like, and I've always said family first, family first. So there you go. So let's take a look at Canvas first and see what we got going in this class to situate you guys. So for those of you who are new to getting class online or new to Canvas, after you log in, if you recall, you just log into mycollege.laccd.edu and you put in your, the first part of your email address. And anyway, if you got this far, you logged in already. And so you would get a page that looks similar to this one. This is the faculty view. So you see labs that haven't been published yet. But if I click student view, hopefully this is kind of what you see. So all of you were able to complete the discussion 1 on introductions. And I started reading them during a break in one of my 2 in-person lab classes at LA Valley College. And so I'm still responding to those. I sent an email out today. Today is Wednesday, by the way. I answered some questions about the labs. I will go over some of those answers right now about lab 1. So the labs on Canvas, your homework, if you will, are the online versions of what we do in class. And I don't expect you to have your own skeletons or anything like that. So it's been kind of an interesting challenge to kind of scour the internet and find 3D models of skulls and stuff. And then, last semester, I kind of volunteered my time and took hundreds of pictures of different angles of different human bones at my house. So let's get it done. So here we go. So, and in the homepage, it says Pierce College, start here. And here are the things that are due by this weekend. Today, I pushed some of the due dates a little bit later, namely the due dates for the labs, because I underestimated how some of your lab manuals may not get to your homes until like this weekend, especially if you didn't purchase them the first day of class. Though I do know some of you already have them. So I gave you an extra day. So the labs are due on Sunday now, but the discussion is still due on Saturday. I already published the quiz that is based on the first 2 labs on the scientific method, measuring indices of skulls and natural selection. So it's only on the first 2 labs. It's already published, and I already published the quiz 1 study guide. If you click on the quiz 1 study guide, what you're going to see, hold on, it's quiz 1 study guide. And here we go. What you're going to see is instructions on how the quiz is going to be structured. It'll have only 12 multiple choice questions. You can take the quiz 3 times, and you have 60 minutes for each attempt. So sometimes my students just don't study for the quiz, take it, and as like a practice quiz the first time they take it, and identify the questions that they got wrong, you know, to kind of figure out the gaps in their knowledge, find out the correct answers to those questions, take it a second or third time, and then get an A in the quiz. Almost every online student of mine has gotten an A on the quiz because I make it a lot easier online. You can take it multiple times. So it's different than, you know, having only 20 minutes in class on a Thursday and that one time to take it, and that's it. Here are the sample multiple choice questions. Out of all these questions on the quiz one study guide, there's 20 of them, only 12 of them will be on the actual quiz. So the quiz is due this Sunday on June 20th. June 20th, by the way, is Father's Day. So for those of you living with your dads or doing something for Papa, I always try to make family come first somehow. So just be aware of that. And, you know, maybe if you have something planned, you may want to get the quiz done a day early. So I'm going to click on here on the assignments link. And I have, here are the upcoming assignments. And so the first one I'm going to talk about in this lecture is part 1 of the first assignment, which is called Lab 1, which correlates, or I should say is the online version of exercise 1 titled The Scientific Method. And that's in the 6th edition of the lab manual. That's important because I'm using 2 different editions of the lab manual. For the last 2 semesters, I use a later edition for my LA Valley College in-person students, and I use an older edition for my Pierce College online students. So here is a rather poor copy saved as a PDF file of exercise 1 titled The Scientific Method. Personally, I think they should have this as 2 labs because each one takes a little while to do and they're on totally different topics. So the first one has you go through 2 mental experiments to experience what it's like to do scientific research, at least hypothetically. No pun intended, hypothesis. Okay. Yeah, sorry, that was pretty bad. So the best thing to do is to read page 7 and self-quiz yourself on the different terms in bold. That's one way to do it. For example, you read science only deals with empirical data. So what is empirical data? Look away. I don't know. Well, according to page 7, empirical data consists of natural phenomena that are observed through our senses or measured using instruments, such as a microscope or telescope, which serve as extensions of our senses and allow us to make an empirical observation. So science only deals with the natural world, our day-to-day world, not the supernatural world, the world of faith and feelings, intuition. So science is, you can think, is like a tool to study things that can be seen or heard or smelled or touched or tasted, things that can be detected using one of your or more of your senses. So that's natural phenomenon. Supernatural phenomenon. What's supernatural phenomenon? Well, if you kind of look at the etymology of the word, or you can say super means over or above, and then natural means of the earth, right? The natural world, the environment, if you will. So supernatural phenomenon means not of this world. Supernatural phenomenon means of the sacred, things that can't be proven using empirical data, but you may feel in your heart are absolutely real. What are some things that empirical data or the scientific method is rather inept at proving? Well, one of those things is a belief in higher power, in God. Another thing is that maybe a memory or feeling of you had a past life. Maybe the certainty that you love your children if you have kids. And if you are a kid, you love your parents, or you love your, significant other, or you are certain that you understand or notice that something is delicious or beautiful. So, so what I'm saying is some of the most important things and experiences of being human just can't be detected using the scientific method, but they're important and we need them to live a meaningful life. Many of us do. So I just want to begin with that. If you scroll to the very end of each lab, there are some study questions. I assigned you to answer the study questions for Lab 1, which is an online version of Exercise 1 titled The Scientific Method, in Lab 2, which is the online version of Exercise 2 titled Natural Selection. So here are the study questions for Lab 1. Some of these questions will be on Quiz 1. So if a kind of an efficient way, if you will, to help you memorize these terms plus answer all the study questions would be to read the front page or the first 2 pages of an exercise and flip back to the study questions and write the answers to each study question as you find them while you're reading. That's why when, an hour later and you finally have measured everything and you get to the study questions, you won't be like, oh God, I'm too tired. It's 11 o'clock at night, right? So be efficient. College is a system in a culture like any other institution. For my reentry students, I can assure you, after going back to college when I was 40 years old, 2 little kids to take care of at home, plus a mortgage to pay and a job, you can get good at this. You're just probably a little rusty. And so for my younger students in high school, you probably already figured this out. You're flying, you know all the shortcuts already probably, right? Okay, so back to page 7. So we defined the empirical data. It's what's the difference between independent variables and dependent variables? And that's another study question, by the way. So independent variables are best defined as things that can change the outcome of your experiment that does not include the experiment. Let me explain. So suppose you were testing a vaccine to prevent people from getting a deadly case of coronavirus, of COVID-19. And you had a vaccine and you found some volunteers, and you had, let's say, 1,000 volunteers who were between the ages of 21 to 25, and they were all, athletes at the community college or wherever, or university. And then you had maybe a bunch of volunteers, the number doesn't matter, and they're 100 years old. And they have heart disease, high blood pressure. Half of them have type 2 diabetes. Some of them have Alzheimer's. A few of them are morbidly obese, and they're very sick people. And so you test the coronavirus vaccine, and let's say you have, 1,000 healthy athletic people, and then 1,000 80-year-old people with underlying health conditions. And these people with underlying health conditions end up dying. Now, was it because of the vaccine, or was it because of their underlying health condition? So one of the important things to know when you do an experiment is you want all the individual, first you want the sample, the collection of individuals that represent all the people or all the plants, all the animals in the world, the population, you know, every individual of that species. You want the sample to be a representative sample. Another thing you want to make sure is that you control for independent variables. So what the best way to test a coronavirus vaccine would be to have all the 80-year-olds in their own sample and then give them the vaccine. Maybe half of them get the actual vaccine and half of them get a placebo. A placebo is a fake vaccine or a fake medication. So in a vaccine, you know, when it's injected, might be just saline, right? There's nothing in it, it's just saline. In a pill, it might be, you know, a pill, sugar pill. So you want to make sure that when you get your results back, that the people who died, who got the vaccine, didn't die of something other than the experiment. They didn't have underlying health conditions. And one way to do that is to test the vaccine on a sample of people with all those health conditions. Half of them get the vaccine, half of them don't. You don't know who gets the real vaccine or the placebo. So then everyone's the same. So if some of them die of the, or some of them don't die, you know, it's not because they were outliers. They're all the same. And you can kind of more pinpoint the cause of death. So independent variables are factors other than the experiment that can change the outcome or mess up the experiment. Dependent variable is just the result or outcome of the experiment. It's a little confusing because both of those key terms have the word variables, but dependent variable is the outcome. Then we get to hypothesis and theory. So the way that I describe hypothesis is that a hypothesis is a restatement of your research question as a declarative. So if your research question is, does this vaccine 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 protect people from getting deadly cases of the coronavirus? The hypothesis would, the positive hypothesis, or H1, would be that question restated or made into a declarative statement, a declarative statement. This vaccine, for example, quote, this vaccine 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 does protect people from the coronavirus. So a hypothesis is like the answer to the research question before you do the research. And the purpose of the research is to prove or disprove that hypothesis. So hypothesis is like an educated guess. It's a temporary answer. It's a provisional answer, whatever you want to call it. So hypothesis means it hasn't been tested yet, right? So what's a theory? Scientifically, a theory is a hypothesis that's been tested many different times and held to be true by most scientists in that field. So a theory is kind of like a statement of fact. I mean, it's never been disproved. But are theories permanent? No. If new evidence appears with new technologies such as genetic testing or whatever appears that makes available evidence that disproves a theory, then the theory is kind of dead. The theory's been disproved. So one of the cool things with science that many Americans didn't understand when that COVID-19 novel coronavirus started infecting people all over the world was that science is a way of finding knowledge from the available empirical data. And it's a way of discovering what's true based on the evidence you have. And if you get new evidence, then it may disprove what you thought was true earlier. So that is kind of like the short version. So what I'm going to go do now is I'm going to open up my lecture slides and kind of go over those terms and then start on and get these exercises done for part 1 of exercise 1, the scientific method. All right, I'm back. So I'm going to share screens here. Here we go. So this is the first lecture for Anthropology 111. And like in all my classes, I introduce to my students what anthropology is, which is pretty useful for students who've never taken an anthro class before. The photo on my front page is one I took myself when I was in Nicaragua a few years ago, and they're of a little family of mantled howler monkeys. Howler monkeys, we're going to talk about primates and different species of primates in this class. Howler monkeys are New World monkeys. New World means the world that was brand new, unknown before to Europeans before Christopher Columbus. So the New World would be the Americas, North America, Central America, and South America. So there's different types of mammals in North, South, and Central America. And there are primates. Primates are an order of mammals. There are about 20 different orders of mammals, from, types of mammals such as narwhals and dolphins to squirrels, raccoons, lions, prairie dogs, meerkats, all kinds of deer, all kinds of mammals. So primates are mammals that are adapted to living in trees, and they have their eyes on the front part of their skull. They don't have their eyes on the sides of their skull like a dog or cat or horse or bear or whatever. So all my lectures begin with overview questions, and typically these overview questions are the same questions as the study questions at the back of these lab manual exercises. The exception is my first lecture where I introduce anthropology. So all of you at this point have either are taking Anthropology 101, Human Biological Evolution, or took it a long time ago. But I just want to remind you, anthropology is a study of humans, human evolution, and human diversity. And research methods investigate aspects of human evolution and human biological and behavioral diversity. So I'm going to skip through here. Anthropology has 4 subfields: cultural anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, and biological anthropology. This anthropology lab deals with non-genetic, non-microbiological research methods that have to do with biological anthropology. So we don't do like CSI forensic analysis using tox screens and DNA or anything like that. We do more old school stuff, if you will, but stuff that's still used today, still important. When we start measuring indices, the lab manual makes a reference to something that most Americans are not that aware of, and many first and second generation immigrants are not aware of in the United States. United States is a country in North America that used to be entirely indigenous until it was colonized by European powers, namely Spain on the West Coast, so that's like California and the American Southwest, and Great Britain or England on the East Coast, so like the 13 original colonies, and they spoke English. Both Spain and Great Britain, and to a certain extent France, persecuted, discriminated against, and enslaved indigenous people. And when they ran out of indigenous people that they can make work and produce wealth for them and take back to Europe, they kidnapped peoples from West African nations and brought them over to the Americas to work in silver mines, sugarcane fields, namely for Spanish and Portuguese colonies in South and Central America, and grow tobacco and cotton and do other things in British colonies. So why do I mention that in a lab class? Because early anthropologists were all male, almost all male, okay, there's always exceptions, and they were all of European ancestry. And they inherited this idea that European as a type of human being, Europeans were superior, and European Americans, European Australians, right, were superior to the native indigenous in those continents, Australia, right, South Africa, and Americas and Mexico. And initially, the early Europeans who came over, fortune seekers, conquistadors, justified murdering indigenous people and using enslaved Africans because they said they were not Christian. So they were committing blasphemy and they were a crime against God. And so, but once all these indigenous and Africans were converted to Catholicism and, you know, the West Coast by the Spanish and Portuguese, or the Spanish anyway, and into, you know, Protestantism or whatever by the British, there became a realization that, well, the Bible says everyone we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, and slavery is wrong. So it seems like they tried to find other justifications to enslave and discriminate against people. And so they tried to use a new epistemology, a new form of knowledge that was just beginning to be very popular with elite business owners and aristocrats, and that was called science. So science is an epistemology. And epistemology is a system of knowledge used to explain things. So what does this have to do with the exercise in the lab manual? Well, because you're trying to explain things using a method or a process called the scientific method. But also is religion. So both science and religion are epistemologies. They're both systems of knowledge. They're both ways of figuring out what's true and what's not true. So the sciences use the scientific method, a process of observation of empirical evidence of the natural world and experimentation to discover what is true. So knowledge is provisional, meaning they make hypotheses, they prove them, they make those hypotheses turn into theories, and they go, this is true. And it's true only as long until new empirical data proves otherwise. So knowledge is temporary from science. It's true for now, right? And knowledge is based on empirical data, evidence that we can observe or detect at least with one of our five senses of things that exist in the natural world. So religion, the reason why science is not appropriate to use to prove religious things is because religious things like faith and certainty and certain supernatural things don't exist in the natural world. They're outside, they're supernatural. So religion as an epistemology uses interpretations of religious doctrine and traditions to establish what has always been true. So what's true for science changes, what's true for religion does not. It's just interpreted differently, right? So knowledge is static in regards, it typically, not always, in some religious traditions. This is the way it's always been, and this is how we interpret the doctrine today. So when we go back to the early anthropologists, first anthropological research started when there was a Norwegian doctor in the 1700s named Carolus Linnaeus, and he categorized all forms of life he could find especially plants that he used to create medicines. I did say he's a doctor. So back in the 1700s, if you were a physician, there was no Rite Aid or CVS. There were apothecaries, and sometimes women would know different healing herbs, but you had to grow your own herbs. You had to have like an encyclopedic knowledge of how to make a pain reliever, like from aspirin. You'd have to know, oh, you have to get the bark from a willow tree and do this and that. So Carolus Linnaeus, he's a very religious man, but he got a little controversial because he classified all plants based on their appearance. So different orders and families of plants that were similar. And then he went ahead and classified humans in an order with monkeys and apes. He said humans are kind of like an ape. Well, that got him in big trouble with the church, because the church says no, people were made in the image of God, and they were all made on, in a week about 6,000 years ago, and in the Garden of Eden and stuff. And then because he came from a very unequal society, and he was kind of borrowing some ideas from Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek scientist who lived about 1,700 years earlier in ancient Greece. And in ancient Athens, where Aristotle lived, and in Europe, where Carolus Linnaeus lived 1,700 years later, there were a lot of inequality. So you had a tiny elite in each country that owned all the land, right? So these were the royal families. And then just below them, you had priests and religious people. And then below them, you had commoners. And below them, you had enslaved peoples. And so he said, oh, well, there are different types of people. I'm going to categorize different types of humans from different parts of the world. And just like there's a hierarchy, and Europeans are at the top because I'm a European, and it's in my interest to say people like me are better than everyone else. So when science as an epistemology started to replace religion as a way of knowing, that kind of hierarchy and that separation of humanity from one family descended from Adam and Eve, were all God's children in religious texts like the Quran and the Bible and stuff, was replaced by this kind of medieval or Renaissance-y scientific perspective that we're all different, like different leaves on different trees and different animals. And some types of people are better than other types of people, which is not true. Then we had the advent of European colonialism, human trafficking, and genocide. So from the mid-1800s to mid-1900s, Europeans and their descendants in their colonies, like the United States and Canada, tried to justify their continued discrimination, enslavement, and genocide of non-Europeans, as well as poor Europeans and Jewish Europeans, by claiming that they were biologically inferior, with claims of social Darwinism. So they're trying to justify being hateful, awful people by saying it's science, it's not me. It's just survival of the fittest. The reason why they're not, the royal family is not because of discrimination. Oh, it's science. Well, they were wrong. But they tried so hard to justify slavery and anti-Semitism by borrowing methods of measuring plants with things like calipers and rulers and things, and they started measuring people. And these were included some early anthropologists. And they were committing fraud. They were cherry picking the empirical evidence that proved their hypotheses. They were not taking representative samples. We can look back today, and if it wasn't so much, racism and discrimination in our own society, we would laugh at them. But fortunately, some of these cultural things have kind of come down to us hundreds of years later. So in the 1900s, beginning with Franz Boas, who was known as the father of anthropology, anthropologists began to use the scientific method to prove that actually there were no superior or inferior groups of people from different parts of the world called races, that actually we are all have the same capability in all these groups of excellence. It's just the only thing that makes us different are these very superficial physical differences based on adaptations to our ancestors' environments. So in the book, it mentions anthropometrics and eugenics and phrenology. So eugenics is a pseudoscience. Pseudo means fake. So eugenics is a fake science, a pseudoscience created to justify social inequality as being based on biologically inherited traits and culturally constructed racial categories that are not supported by scientific evidence. The word eugenics was coined by a second cousin of Charles Darwin named Francis Galton. Galton was about 20 years younger than his uncle / second cousin Darwin, and he so wanted to be famous as a scientist and a rational person. And so what he did is he did not take representative samples of people in England to prove his point, and he ignored independent variables. Galton ignored independent variables like the effects of poverty, malnutrition, pollution, social discrimination on people's academic achievement, intelligence, and economic success. In other words, he gave like SAT type tests and measured the poorest people, homeless people in England. And instead of coming up with the answer that, oh, they are that way because they're poor, he claimed they are that way because they are physically inferior. And he just ignored the fact that they weren't allowed to get good jobs because they were Irish and it was London, 200, 100 years ago or whatever. And a lot of Irish were discriminated. So some of that kind of eugenics ideas, this kind of social Darwinism, this kind of claim that poor families are that way because there's something essentially wrong with them, is still, unfortunately, believed and held as a way to justify just plain old vanilla discrimination until recently. For example, as recently as the mid-1970s, some states like North Carolina had eugenics panels who would decide on who has to get a forced sterilization of women. And those women typically were women of color or very poor women. They were never a wealthy woman who had to be forced to be sterilized, even if she was batshit crazy and probably shouldn't have kids. So it was always poor people or minorities. The USC Medical Center practiced sterilized Latinas, first generation immigrants from Mexico and Central America, without their consent. If they gave birth in that hospital, they would just give them a form in English and go, if you want to have a baby in this hospital, you got to sign this form. And they're like, oh, okay. And then they wonder why they couldn't have kids. It's a true story. Google it. There's documentaries about both online and elsewhere. So Franz Boas disproved white supremacy in eugenics using the scientific method. Franz Boas was experienced discrimination himself in his native Germany due to native-born Euro-American fears of being replaced by immigrants in the early 1900s, because there was a flood of immigrants, a lot of Eastern European Jews fleeing anti-Semitism in the newly communist USSR run by Stalin, fleeing to Western Europe to escape the pogroms, these mass murders. The US government, there was a lot of alarm and fear by native people, native-born Americans. Many of them had, ancestors in England and Germany. There was fear that, there's all these immigrants and they're going to change America. and they're going to vote in, you know, who knows, some Eastern European president. So we need to stop the change. So we need to stop immigration. Does that sound super familiar to you? Like last year? Yeah. So anyway, there was this famous Dillingham Commission named after the Senator Dillingham, I think it's Connecticut, and he asked Franz Boas to research immigrants. He wanted got government money and says, I need some anthropologists to prove that immigrants are biologically inferior and are threatening our nation with, you know, sickly hordes of sickly people. We need to stop immigration. So Franz Boas collected other anthropologists as students, and they were able to measure and test about 17,381 first and second generation immigrants. So they measured immigrants who were born in their native Poland or Russia or Sicily, and their children who were born here, second generation. And what they wanted to see is that were their children just like their parents, you know, short, sickly, speak another language, or would the children kind of assimilate into American culture and be healthier and taller? So that was in 1908. By 1911, I mean, only 3 years later, Boas published his anthropological report on ethnic and racial differences of immigrants to the United States called Changes in Bodily Form of Descendants of Immigrants. The report's main conclusion was this: quote, the adaptability of the immigrant seems to be very much greater than we had a right to suppose before investigations were instituted. In other words, children born in the United States, even if their parents were illiterate and physically unwell, who were born in another country, actually were just as smart as native born children from Northern or Western Europe, and had more in common with the native born children of different ethnic groups than they did with their parents. Whoa. Intellectually and physically. Or in other words, as Boas summarized, what people did rather than who they were ought to be the starting point for a legitimate science of society, and by extension, the basis for government policy in immigration. So biological anthropology has two key concepts, and we're going to learn research methods for both of them. Research methods that have to do investigating human evolution, including behavioral evolution by investigating behaviors of monkeys and apes, and human diversity. So why people are shaped differently and why people act differently. And they use the scientific method. The scientific method is defined as a method of research for producing knowledge about the natural world in which empirical data are analyzed in order to answer a research question and or test hypothesis in order to find out what is true. Scientific studies must be reproducible. They must use a sample of data, whereas a later researcher, like a student like you, can come out and get a similar sample and come out with the same result. If it's not reproducible, then there's something wrong with the sample. It doesn't reflect the world, real world situation. It doesn't reflect the species or population, if you will. So I already defined epistemology. And so the scientific method is a process of discovery of several steps. First, a research question is defined. So something you want to know, one thing you want to know. Then you do some preliminary research by reading other people's research. So you do a Google search and you figure out, what do we know so far, or what have other people found out so far about this topic? And then you form a hypothesis. And you try to figure out a research method to prove or disprove your hypothesis. Now, do you remember what a hypothesis is? This is important. If you don't, you may want to stop this video and look up hypothesis, or none of this is going to make sense. So a methodology is formed to operationalize how and what kind of empirical data you will collect that either proves or falsifies your hypothesis. Data is collected via either experiment, right? Like if you want to test a vaccine, you want to see if the vaccine works, or just observation, right? Say if you want to know if an animal is more active, a species of animal is more active at night or during the day, you're just going to have to find those animals in the wild and observe them and see when they're more active. All right, I'm back. And then you collect your data. Yeah, you need to identify the independent variables and make sure they're all the same for your sample. So you make sure the result you're seeing is the result from the prove or disprove your hypothesis, or a result due to the experiment, not just something wrong with your sample, or it makes it different from the other individuals in the sample. And then an analysis of the data is made that it either verifies or falsifies the hypothesis, and then a conclusion is made. And if you falsify the hypothesis, then you can circle back and then create a new research question, a new hypothesis. And it's kind of like trial by error, right? You just try things and try things. So here's a schematic of the scientific method: observations, research, question, hypothesis. If you want to predict, if then, test, hypothesis supported, that's great. Hypothesis rejected, circle back and create a new research question, new hypothesis, and try another experiment. So empirical data means based on observation or experiment that is detectable using one or more of the 5 senses. Data is evidence gathered to help answer questions, solve problems, fill gaps in scientific knowledge. So data comes from the real world. Data is not what you read on the internet. Okay, not primary data. Okay, so you have primary data and secondary data. Primary data is data you see with your own eyes. Secondary data is what you read about. So scientific method is a primary research method that deals with empirical data from the real world, primary. A sample is a group of individuals that must represent the entire population being studied. If that's impossible, it's like, say you want to test a vaccine, you would make the scope of your research more narrow. You would say something like, we're going to see the effectiveness of this vaccine only on people ages 18 to 50, or only women. You see what I mean? So you can make it more narrow, and that way you get a representative sample of that smaller, more narrowly defined population. So when doing an experiment, you should have like a baseline sample. So a baseline sample is when you take a sample, you divide it in half, and then half of it you do the experiment on, and the other half you don't. And then you compare both halves of that sample to see the results of the experiment. A typical way to talk about samples is to refer to them with the letter N, as in number, equals, and then the number of individuals in that sample. So when that Dillingham Commission research project headed by Franz Boas, the N, if you will, the number in the sample was like 17,341 or something like that. So N1 is not a valid data set. So if you're having a conversation with someone and that person, let's say you're talking about the coronavirus, and the person says, well, I got the coronavirus last year, I tested positive and I'm fine. So this is just like the flu. And you can ask that person, okay, so your body represents every different type of person in the world? No, of course not. Each person is unique, and different categories of people are very different. And people who are in their elder years, who are, 80 or 90, have very different systems than people in their juvenile years who are 8 or 9. So, hypothesis is a testable statement that potentially explains specific phenomena observed in the natural world. So when I ask you in the study questions, what's the difference between a hypothesis and a theory? Hypothesis is a testable statement that potentially explains the specific phenomena observed in the natural world. A hypothesis that has been repeatedly tested, never disproven, is called a theory. A theory is an explanation why a natural phenomenon takes place that has never been disproved using scientific methods. In other words, a theory is a hypothesis that has never been disproven by science, or a theory is a former hypothesis that is believed by most scientists in that field. Theory can be refuted by new empirical evidence that disproves it. An example of a refuted theory in anthropology would be the out of Africa replacement theory of modern human evolution. With the advent of new genetic information and evidence that most humans in the world today carry in their genomes some genes inherited from ancestors who were not human, like Homo neanderthalensis and Homo denisova. Now that they had to make a new theory about modern humans, and that's called the assimilation theory of modern human evolution, in that the very first anatomically modern humans evolved in Africa toward the end of the Ice Age, the Pleistocene. They started, walking out of Africa, walking up through West Asia, up through Europe, and they came upon different species of hominins that evolved earlier up in Europe and Asia. And they made families with them. They had kids with them. So today, most people in the world have, a great, times 20,000 or whatever, 20, and grandma who was a Neanderthal. The exception are people who have no ancestry outside of the African continent. Then they're 100% Europe, African, 100% Homo sapiens ancestry. A scientific law is a statement of fact describing natural phenomenon. Scientific laws are accepted by nearly all scientists in a discipline and predict phenomena. Scientific laws are often mathematically defined. So here's an example of a scientific method, and this is an example called Darwin's hypothesis. So even though Darwin was not an anthropologist, he was the first evolutionary biologist. We're going to go with this because it has to do with an anthropological topic. So he had a research question: why did bipedalism evolve in apes? Bipedalism means the ability to stand and walk most of the time on the hind legs. So his observations include humans walking on two legs, on their hind legs, being bipedal, and apes walking on all fours. So he made an hypothesis. He stated that bipedalism evolved when apes no longer lived in trees. However, there is new data or new observations since Darwin's time when he was alive, and recent paleoarchaeological and genetic research shows that the first hominins actually evolved in tropical forests and likely slept in trees. So Darwin's hypothesis was refuted. It was falsified. Bipedalism evolved when apes still lived in trees. So why did bipedalism evolve? Well, some anthropologists believe that bipedalism evolved, our own species evolved, because by being able to walk on hind legs and carry weapons, it allowed our ancestors to hunt more effectively and defend themselves better, live longer, get more food, and have more children. And eventually, over time, we evolved. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to steps in the scientific method. So exercise 1.1 asks you to evaluate a thought experiment on page 9. In this exercise, you'll be conducting a thought experiment. That is, you do not actually do the experiment, but you think the experiment through. Yeah, I know I'm reading the page, but hopefully this will find this helpful. So the research question is the following, quote, does talking to plants help them grow, unquote. The hypothesis of this experiment, and I'll give you a heads up, this is not a good experiment, but you're going to write why it's a bad experiment in a moment. The hypothesis says, quote, a plant that is talked to will grow taller and produce larger flowers than plants that have not been talked to, end quote. The experiment or the methodology goes like this. Plant a seed, that means one seed, talk to the growing plant each day and record how tall it grows, end quote. Your observations, so this is the data that you're going to analyze. You planted a seed. You watched it grow for 3 weeks, talking to it several times a day. It grew tall with a lot of leaves and produced a beautiful flower. Question, did this experiment prove that talking to a plant helps it grow? The answer is no. What is wrong with this experiment? List 3 reasons why this experiment failed to support the hypothesis. Well, remember I said a sample has to be more than one. So that's the first thing. So a plant. When it said a plant, a scientific experiment has to have a sample size that is greater than 1. So the other thing wrong with this is if you planted one seed and you talked to it and it grew tall, how do you know talking to it made it grow tall? Because you don't have another plant that you didn't talk to. So this experiment is missing a baseline sample out of its total sample. Okay, so there's nothing to compare it to. Finally, what do you mean by plant? It is not possible to get a representative sample of all the organisms in the kingdom Plantae. Like all the kinds of plants, like everything from grass to redwood trees, both of which don't have flowers, some of them don't, to vines, to sunflowers, which do have flowers. So the population plants is too broad and needs to be narrowed to a single species of plant. So those are some of the answers I came up with. All right, I'm going to erase this and go on to the next question. Okay, the next question on the top of page 10, it asks you to describe 3 things that you would do to change the experiment that will increase the odds of proving or disproving our hypothesis. So what's the hypothesis? A plant that is talked to will grow taller and produce larger flowers. Okay, so the first thing I would do is rephrase the hypothesis. So that's what I would do. But maybe you think of something different. So I would rephrase the hypothesis to be about a single species of plant. I would have a representative sample of this single species with two groups. The baseline group not talked to, and the experimental group talked to. And then finally, I would control for the independent variables. So all the plants, baseline group and experimental group are grown in the same environment. So for example, the ones that I talked to, they're not going to get more water, they're not going to get more sunlight, they're going to be exactly the same. So that's what I would put there. You can put what you want, but something similar to that would be probably best. Observation. So I'm still on the bottom of page 10. You notice that the plant you were talking to is growing taller with more leaves and flowers and the same type of plant that is sitting in another room of the house. So, okay, so they got two plants now, a baseline and experimental, right? And then the baseline one that you're not talking to is in another room of the house. Does this prove that talking to a plant helps it grow? It does not. List two hypotheses for why the plant you were talking to is doing better than the one you're ignoring. So two hypotheses could be the plant I'm ignoring is in my personal walk-in refrigerator. There is no sunlight. That might be one reason. So that's an independent variable. The plant that I'm ignoring, I'm actually not taking care of it at all and not watering it and dumped out its and my puppy knocked it over and chewed it up. So I'm just being silly here, but I think you get the idea. All right, so we're almost done in part 2. So top of page 11, it has a question. And this is still regards to this thought experiment about the plants. Consider all 3 parts of this exercise, the original experiment, the improvements, and the further observation, and identify which variables you would measure as your dependent variables and which variables you'd measure as your independent variables. List 3 of each kind. So dependent variables, do you remember what dependent variables are? Oop. Sorry. Let me clear screens. So what's a dependent variable? A dependent variable equals the results you are measuring in your experiment. So what are things you're measuring when you talk to plants? It just said grow. So what are other things you can measure? So it's height, number of leaves, number of flowers, if it's a flowering plant, color of leaves, etc. So these are the different things you're measuring. What about independent variables? So what are things that both the baseline group and experimental group need to be controlled for, need to be exactly the same? So you could say plant species, plant care, like water, sunlight, and everything. What you, the sound of talking to the experimental group has to be the same. So for example, what if you like some of the plants you talk to, what if you like blew a loud horn at it, or what if you talk to some of the plants with a recording of your voice on your phone, and other plants you talk to in person. And actually what's happening is that you're delivering that group that you're talking to in person more carbon dioxide, because how does respiration work for plants, right? They absorb carbon dioxide, and through the process of photosynthesis, they convert some of that with other things into energy through photosynthesis, and they exhale oxygen. One more reason not to cut down a tree, and why deforestation is accelerating climate change, because the more trees and forests you cut down, that's the less plants that absorb carbon dioxide and, emissions. So yeah, so independent variables is like, make sure the sound of talking to you is in the same format. It's not just a recording. And if it's just your voice, how do you know, if it's just you in person, how do you know it's not the sound of you talking, but it's just, blowing all this carbon dioxide on their little leaves? So just some thoughts. All right. Now, design an experiment to examine one of the following phenomena using the bold items and the steps of the scientific method. Pick from the following: A, leaves turn orange in the fall. B, students who eat breakfast earn higher grades. C, select any other phenomenon you observed or curious about. So this is where you decide you make your own experiment. Most of my students choose students who eat breakfast earn higher grades. Some of the independent variables that can screw up that experiment, I'll just give you a heads up on it, is not all students are the same. Not all classes are the same level of difficulty. Some classes, it's easier to get higher grades. Some teachers, it's easier to get a higher grade than other teachers, right? Not all breakfasts are the same. So just want to give you a heads up. And then what are the dependent variables? What are you measuring? So you can complete that. And that's it for part one of a very long lab. This is probably the longest lab, the first one, right? And so my next recording will be part two. So I hope you find that helpful. If you need any extra help, please send me an email or post a question in discussions. And I'm going to go through the discussions probably Friday, because I have to catch up on this class and a lot of recordings to make, and I'm teaching so much. But hopefully I'll get all caught up, and then I'll be able to help you day by day during the week in this class. So I'm just a little bit behind. If you want immediate help, one-on-one help, just send me an email using the Canvas inbox. I check this every day. So don't get upset and let yourself get frustrated. Just send me an email. I'm here if you need more time. Unless it's the last day of the semester or last week of the semester, I'll probably give you more time. Regardless, I'm here to help. So talk to me. All right. And there we go. And you will see me later.